The fall of Number 10 has begun. In a stunning judgment that shook the foundations of British politics, the Supreme Court has ordered Prime Minister Keir Starmer to step down immediately. What started as whispers of scandal has exploded into the most devastating political crisis in modern history. A sitting Prime Minister forced out not by the ballot box, but by the highest court in the land. The nation now finds itself staring into the abyss of uncertainty, wondering whether the rule of law will prevail or whether Britain is about to descend into chaos. It began with a single ruling, but its shockwaves ripped through the country like an earthquake. The Supreme Court, in a unanimous and extraordinary decision, declared that Keir Starmer could no longer remain in office. Their reasoning was blunt and unflinching. No man, no matter how powerful, stands above the law. For generations, Number 10 had been seen as untouchable, the fortress of British leadership. But now its very occupant was branded unlawful, unfit, and stripped of authority. The courtroom itself fell silent as the judgment was read. Outside reporters scrambled to relay the news. Within minutes, headlines screamed across every front page. Prime Minister ordered out, Supreme Court ends his reign. Number 10 falls. Social media erupted in a frenzy of disbelief and outrage. Supporters cried conspiracy. Opponents demanded justice. And the public, already weary of scandal after scandal, watched in stunned silence as the walls of government seemed to crumble in real time. Investigations that had once been dismissed as rumours now stood fully exposed. Missing funds traced to shell companies, offshore accounts swelling with unexplained deposits, lavish gifts flowing from billionaires seeking favours, designer suits, private jet excursions, bottles of wine worth more than a family's monthly income, all pointing to a pattern not of oversight, but of deliberate corruption. What Britain saw was not merely bad judgment, it was betrayal calculated and cold. The Supreme Court's judgment was clear. Starmer had abused his office, twisted the machinery of government into a personal empire, and in doing so, had waged war against the very idea of democracy. In their own words, his conduct was a direct assault on the constitutional fabric of the United Kingdom. No longer could he claim legitimacy. No longer could he pretend to govern. Within the walls of Number 10, panic reigned. Aides scrambled, some rushing to destroy documents, others quietly resigning in shame. Senior cabinet ministers held tense meetings behind closed doors, their loyalty shattered under the crushing weight of evidence. Letters of no confidence began to circulate as one by one the allies who once stood proudly at Starmer's side abandoned him. What had been the seat of power was now reduced to a fortress under siege, and the streets reflected that siege. Protesters poured into Westminster, their voices echoing across the capital. "Resign now, no one is above the law." Placards rose into the air, banners stretched across bridges, and chants filled Parliament Square. Riot police in helmets and shields formed lines as the crowd swelled their chants, transforming into roars of defiance. London was no longer a capital of quiet governance. It had become a battlefield of voices. The monarchy, once an untouchable figure in the background of politics, was suddenly thrust into the storm. King Charles, cutting short his time in Balmoral, convened emergency meetings with advisors, judges, and senior politicians. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, whispers spread of the nuclear option, the royal prerogative to dismiss a sitting prime minister. What had long been a relic of history was now being openly discussed as Britain teetered on the brink of constitutional collapse. The international reaction was just as fierce. Washington issued late-night statements of concern. Brussels called for emergency meetings. Financial markets spiralled out of control. The pound plunged to levels unseen since the financial crash of 2008. Investors fled. Bond yields spiked. Britain, once seen as a beacon of democratic stability, now looked like a nation on the verge of freefall. But perhaps the most dangerous blow came not from protesters or foreign leaders, but from within the state itself. Civil servants in Whitehall, sworn to serve the Crown, began openly refusing to follow orders they believed unlawful. Permanent secretaries froze access to defence files, blocked communication systems, and cut Starmer off from critical government machinery. In one chilling remark, a senior official said, "He may still sit in Number 10, but the state no longer serves him." For the armed forces, the crisis was no less urgent. Generals and senior officers quietly held their own meetings, drafting contingency plans, should the Prime Minister attempt to issue illegal commands. Units were placed on standby. Military lay. By dawn, Westminster looked less like the centre of government and more like a fortress under siege. Barricades lined the streets. Riot police clashed with furious demonstrators, and chants of "Starmer out" echoed through the heart of London. What had begun as protest now swelled into something larger, something darker, a movement that carried the energy of rebellion. The fall of Number 10 was no longer just a political story. It was a national reckoning. Inside the once untouchable walls of Downing Street, panic had become the new normal. Senior aides resigned in waves, carrying boxes of files as they left. Confidential papers vanished into shredders. Hard drives were wiped clean, and corridors once filled with the hum of power were reduced to whispers of collapse. Ministers who only days ago defended their Prime Minister were now drafting resignation letters and speaking in hushed tones of betrayal. The House of Power had transformed into a bunker of fear. The Supreme Court's judgment had already exposed a staggering web of corruption. Tens of thousands in missing funds, secret gifts from billionaire donors and shell companies designed to mask illicit payments. But new revelations poured in with every passing hour. Leaked emails revealed direct promises of policy changes in exchange for money. One donor demanded relaxed regulations on defence contracts, and within weeks the policy was quietly altered. Another offered lavish hospitality, and in return saw investigations against their companies mysteriously stalled. The court called it the systematic sale of public office. Journalists called it the greatest political scandal of the century. Starmer, however, refused to accept reality. In a second broadcast delivered with a defiance bordering on desperation, he branded the Supreme Court's judgment a judicial coup and vowed never to resign. He claimed enemies in the press and Parliament were conspiring to overthrow him. He insisted the people stood with him even as tens of thousands marched outside demanding his resignation. His words, once heavy with authority, now sounded hollow, echoing like the final speeches of a fallen leader clinging to power. The institutions of the state moved swiftly to cut him off. Civil servants openly rejected his orders. Permanent secretaries restricted his access to sensitive files and refused to carry out commands they deemed unlawful. Intelligence briefings were locked away, military protocols withheld, and communication systems rerouted. The Prime Minister may still sit in number 10, one senior official declared, but the government has already moved on without him. Britain's machinery of state was operating, but not for the man who claimed to lead it. At Buckingham Palace, the gravity of the crisis deepened. King Charles, visibly sombre, convened emergency sessions with advisers, justices and parliamentarians. The question of royal prerogative, unused since 1834, was now discussed in deadly seriousness. Could the king dismiss a prime minister who refused to obey the law? Could the crown act to save democracy from collapse? For centuries, these questions had been buried in history. Now they were the only questions that mattered. Behind closed doors, palace officials prepared for the possibility of a televised address. Drafts of speeches circulated, words that could declare Starmer's government unlawful and his authority void. Such a move would shatter, convention redefine the monarchy's role, and plunge Britain into untested waters. But with every hour that Starmer refused to step aside, the pressure mounted on the crown to act. Beyond Britain, the world watched in disbelief. Washington issued grave warnings, its officials alarmed at the collapse of order in their closest ally. Brussels convened emergency summits, fearing instability would ripple across Europe. Financial markets spiraled further into chaos. The pound sank to historic lows, investors fled, and analysts warned of a looming economic crash that could devastate ordinary households already burdened by rising costs. Britain's proud reputation as a stable democracy was crumbling before the world's eyes. The military, too, was drawn into the storm. Senior officers sworn to defend the constitution quietly placed units on standby. Contingency plans were prepared should the Prime Minister attempt to seize power through unlawful orders. One general reportedly told colleagues, "Our duty is to the nation, not to one man." The symbolism was chilling. For the first time in modern history, Britain's armed forces were preparing not to defend the government, but to defend the constitution from its own Prime Minister. Meanwhile, the streets of London grew more volatile by the hour. Protesters lit fires in Parliament Square, their chants rising into roars that shook the very gates of Westminster. Makeshift barricades were erected, and clashes with police turned violent. Videos of the chaos spread instantly across